Fairly Oddparents have spawned some really dark theories for being such a bright cartoon. From the idea of Cosmo not being Poof's real father, to Trixie Tang having a fairy of her own, hidden in plain sight this whole time. Trust me, these next 10 Fairly Oddparents theories will forever change how you view the Nickelodeon Classic, and stick around to the end if you're curious to see what Timmy's parents' life would have looked like had he never been born. This theory claims that all of the magic and wishes that we saw granted to Timmy throughout the show were all figments of his imagination. Yeah, that's right, fairies didn't exist in the Fairly Oddparents universe. Now, a child's imagination making up the whole thing isn't that bad, but turns out there's a darker reason behind Timmy having more than one fairy in his imagination-based adventures. In the episode that showed the flashback of Timmy's parents moving into their Dimsdale home, we learned that they initially thought Timmy was a girl. That's why all of his belongings were pink, and even explained why we eventually saw pictures of Timmy wearing a dress in other episodes. But according to this theory, that's not what we saw at all. In fact, what we were really looking at were pictures of Timmy's twin sister. However, following a tragic incident in their lives, Timmy's sister ended up dying, and Timmy was left all alone for the first time, which is why we never got to see her in the show. It's also why he started wearing his pink shirt and hat. His parents already had the clothes, and Timmy simply missed his sister. Because he felt as though he wasn't whole without his twin sister, he imagined not one, but two fairies of the same genders as him and his sister to fill in the void of such a loss. This next theory throws around the idea that Timmy only believed he had Fairly Oddparents because of the strong antidepressants that he was prescribed. Timmy Turner was a child who had severe depression and suffered from anxiety attacks, which the series indicated through the use of his so-called Fairly Oddparents, aka his troubled imagination. Timmy was shown having a rough childhood to the point where even his own parents often neglected him. They also forced Timmy to spend almost every day being tormented by his evil babysitter Vicky, which could have easily caused Timmy to develop such traumatic problems. But instead of getting fairies, Timmy's parents took him to a psychiatrist where, instead of getting Cosmo and Wanda, he was prescribed Prozac and Zoloft. Unfortunately for Timmy, the two incredibly strong antidepressants had intense side effects for Timmy, like troubled sleeping and increased nervousness. The timing of Timmy getting prescribed antidepressants would have also coincided with the rule that children only get Fairly Oddparents when they need them the most. A very interesting parallel to the idea of a doctor prescribing these drugs to a kid under the right circumstances. Trixie Tang's parents were as corrupt as they were rich, and that's why she had more influence around Dimsdale than Doug Dimmadome did. Hereditor, Cosmic Biohazard, came up with this theory and concluded that Trixie's parents both worked for the government and were viciously corrupt, behavior that Trixie inherited, and explains why she always walked around like she owned the place. People in town were always shown walking on eggshells around her, and it was because of how terrifying her parents were. This gave Trixie the ability to act like a brat and still be able to get anything that she wanted. And speaking of Trixie, this next one states that Veronica wasn't simply Trixie's best friend, but also her fairy. And Butch Hartman practically rubbed this fact in our faces. When you look closely at all of the human characters in the show, you'll start to notice a pattern, specifically with their eyes. None of them had any pupils. This is true for almost all of the humans in Fairly Oddparents. All of them except Veronica, who clearly had pupils. Fairies, on the other hand, always had pupils, which suggests that Veronica must have been a fairy the entire time. Only, unlike Cosmo and Wanda, who like to hide from the public by becoming inanimate objects or animals, Veronica chose to hide in plain sight. Eagle-eyed fans also spotted another connection between Veronica and the fairies, and that would be the star that she used to hold up her ponytail. It's not a stretch to say that it resembled the star that was always found on a fairy's wand. It turns out that the entire time Timmy was longing for Trixie to notice him, she was hiding a massive secret. According to John Negroni, the real lesson in the Fairly Oddparents is that Timmy didn't need his fairies in the first place. Negroni is an author who is very popular for writing fan theories, and he believes that the entire show revolved around one premise: you don't really grow up until you figure out how to properly deal with your problems. This theme was found in almost every episode, and at the end of the day, Timmy always had to learn that he couldn't just wish his problems away. That's why every time Timmy tried to fix one of his problems by making a wish, it always backfired and created more problems for him instead. When all was said and done, Timmy always learned how to fix the problem for himself. It's like the entire purpose for Timmy having Fairly Oddparents in the first place was to prove to himself that he didn't need them. Cosmo and Wanda both inadvertently showed Timmy that it was important to deal with his issues himself, rather than expecting someone else to do it for him. But once Timmy realized that, his fairies would have likely considered him grown up, and they would have disappeared. A fan theory on Reddit suggests that the human world was actually ruled by fairies all along. While watching the show, it's hard not to notice how careless and borderline neglectful the adults that lived in Dimsdale were. And we're not just talking about Timmy's parents. That's because the fairies used their magical powers to alter the mental state of any adult they came in contact with. So so that they could make the world more habitable for fairy kind. The only 2 adults in the show who appeared to have their lives in order were the Dinkelbergs, 2 of the only adults in town that didn't have children. That's because all of the other adults had children, and many of those children had fairies. And whenever those adults discovered that their children had fairies, the fairies would simply wipe their memory using that device that we saw get used on Mr. Crocker when he was a child. And like we saw with Mr. Crocker, prolonged exposure to the memory wiping tool could eventually be enough to drive a person insane. So the more they wiped the adults' memories, the more time they got to spend out in the world, and the easier it was for them to control it. Next up, we have a theory that considers the idea that Timmy Turner was subjected to an abusive household growing up, which caused him to imagine everything that we saw in the show. The series has shown us on multiple occasions that Timmy's parents often neglected him, but it might not stop there. We also saw that Timmy's parents didn't respect his privacy, and that Mr. Turner had a history of having rage issues, particularly when it came to the Dinkelbergs. All those signs point to something much darker happening in the Turner house behind closed doors. It turns out that Timmy might have been the victim of physical abuse, which caused him to imagine a world where he had 2 magical friends that wouldn't let him get hurt anymore. The theory also suggested that Timmy modeled Cosmo and Wanda after his grandparents, the only 2 people in his life that seemed to actually care for him. But when they passed away, he needed someone else. So his adolescent mind turned his 2 ordinary goldfish into Fairly Oddparents that would take care of him just like his grandparents used to when he needed them the most. With all of the talk about multiverses lately, it shouldn't surprise you in the least to find out that the Fairly Oddparents might have been home to a multiverse. According to this theory on Reddit, the fairies were able to spread their magic and themselves all across the multiverse, which is why almost none of the wishes that Timmy made ended up affecting the show's continuity. Instead, the Fairly Oddparents was like most other cartoons from the early 2000s, and each episode acted as if the world had reset and Timmy hadn't made the wishes that we saw him make in the previous episodes. Except, in this case, instead of the world resetting, Cosmo and Wanda were actually traveling across the multiverse, granting wishes to every version of Timmy that existed. And if that's the case, then that would explain why only Mr. Crocker is ever curious about the strange happenings around Dimsdale. None of the other adults seem to even know that weird things are popping up all over the town. It's because it all really happened in various parallel universes. Cosmo might not have been Poof's real father, even though he was the one who gave birth to the little guy. Poof was introduced in the series in the first episode of season 6, which was actually a 2-part episode titled Fairly Odd Baby. He was the first fairy baby born in more than 10,000 years, and for a while, everyone believed that he was Cosmo and Wanda's son. But when you look at Poof, he doesn't really have any of his parents' traits. Not a single part of him was green like Cosmo or pink like Wanda. This was odd because when you look at all of the other fairly odd relatives, they all had something in common with one another. While Wanda's family had pink eyes and Cosmo's had green, Poof for some reason was born with a purple color palette, begging the question, where did the color purple come from? Well, in case you didn't know, fairy children are conceived through magic rather than other more intimate methods. So say Wanda and Cosmo tried to have a child, they could have discovered that he was infertile, and instead he had to find someone else's genetics to use. And there is one fairy that comes to mind when we think of the color purple. Wandissimo was Wanda's ex-boyfriend who was shown trying to steal her back from Cosmo multiple times throughout the show. He would have likely jumped at the chance to father a child for her, and since they used magic, Cosmo still carried Poof during his pregnancy and raised him as if he was his own. Dinkelberg was everything that Timmy's parents wished they could be, and it was all because they didn't have a kid. A theory on Reddit explained that Mr. Turner's hatred that we see him have toward his neighbors wasn't because the Dinkelbergs were evil, but because they represented Mr. Turner's dream life. We learned through the show that Timmy's dad and Mr. Dinkelberg were best friends in high school, but grew apart once Dinkelberg started dating his future wife. While Timmy's dad became a pencil sharpener for a living, he got to watch Dinkelberg become successful. Then when the Turners finally settled down and had a child, the Dinkelbergs moved in right next door. And while the Turner family was financially affected by having a kid, which as you might know is very expensive, they got to watch as the Dinkelbergs excelled in everything and lived a life of luxury. On top of that, the Reddit theory also explained that the Dink part of Dinkelberg could have been an acronym for double income, no kids, which only further rubs in the fact that their lives are better because, unlike the Turners, the Dinkelbergs don't have children. This theory would also explain why Timmy's mother and father neglected him so much, and were quick to hand him over to Vicky to watch, because they sometimes wished that he didn't exist. Which dark Fairly Odd Parents theory was your favorite out of today's video? Let us know in the comments below.